That's how these stories always start, right? You think you're walking into some cushy little job. Put the kid to bed, munch on snacks, binge watch something dumb on their Netflix, and then you leave $100 richer by midnight. That's exactly what I thought when I agreed to watch the Jennings' kid last month. I didn't know them that well. They just moved into our neighborhood a couple of weeks earlier. And Mrs. Jennings had come by my house one afternoon, all smiles, asking if I babysat. Her son Caleb was 5. Sweet kid, shy. She and her husband had a work thing coming up on a Friday night and couldn't find anyone else. I could use the cash, so I said yes. When I showed up that evening, the house was eerily quiet. You know that kind of quiet where you can almost hear your own heartbeat? Mrs. Jennings greeted me at the door, wearing a sleek black dress, her hair done up like she was headed to the Oscars. She seemed nervous, though. Her eyes kept darting toward the stairs as she rattled off instructions. Caleb had already eaten, bedtime was 8:30, and don't open the basement door. It's a mess down there. She handed me a list of emergency numbers, kissed Caleb goodbye, and left with her husband. It was just me and the kid. The first hour was fine. Caleb was polite but quiet. We played with his toy cars for a bit before I let him watch some cartoon while I scrolled through my phone. At around 8:15, I told him it was time to get ready for bed. He didn't argue, which surprised me. Most kids drag it out, but Caleb just nodded and went upstairs. I tucked him in, read him a quick bedtime story, and turned off the light. And that's when things started to feel off. As I sat downstairs on the couch, flipping through channels, I kept hearing these faint noises. At first, I thought it was Caleb getting up to use the bathroom, but the sounds weren't coming from upstairs. They were lower, like under the floor. I remembered what Mrs. Jennings said about the basement. Maybe it was just the water heater or the furnace acting up. But then there was this loud thump. It wasn't the kind of noise you could ignore. It sounded like something heavy had hit the basement floor. I froze. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my head. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, but my brain wouldn't stop imagining the worst. An animal had gotten in, or maybe someone was down there. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and tiptoed to the basement door. It was locked. That should have been comforting, right? If it was locked, then no one could get in or out. But the thump came again, louder this time, like someone was pounding on the floor from below. I thought about calling the Jennings, but what was I supposed to say? Hey, I know you said not to worry about the basement, but I think your house might be haunted. Instead, I did something really stupid. I knocked on the door. Hello? I called out. My voice cracked. Silence. I stood there for a few seconds, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Then I heard it, a faint, muffled sound. It wasn't the thumping this time. It was crying. A child's crying. I whipped around and ran upstairs to Caleb's room. I needed to make sure he was still in bed. My hands were shaking as I opened his door, but there he was, fast asleep, his little face peaceful. I wanted to wake him up and ask if he'd heard the noises, but what good would that do? He was just a kid. So I went back downstairs, turned on every light in the living room, and sat there with my phone clutched in my hand like it was a weapon. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Houses make noises, old pipes, creaky floorboards. That's all it was. But then I heard the lock on the basement door rattle. I nearly screamed. My whole body went cold and I couldn't move. The door handle twisted slowly, like someone was trying to open it from the other side. And then it stopped. I don't know how long I sat there staring at that door. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Finally, I got up the nerve to call Mrs. Jennings. Hi, sorry to bother you, I said when she answered. My voice was shaking so badly I could barely get the words out. I think there's something wrong with your basement. I keep hearing noises and... Don't open the door, she cut me off. Her voice was sharp, almost panicked. I didn't, I said quickly, but I think someone might be down there. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, just keep Caleb safe. We'll be home soon. She hung up before I could say anything else. I wanted to run out of the house, grab Caleb and leave, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I just sat there, staring at that door, praying it wouldn't open. When the Jennings finally got home, Mrs. Jennings rushed past me without a word and unlocked the basement door. She disappeared down the stairs, and I swear I heard her whispering to someone down there. Mr. Jennings handed me an envelope of cash and said, "Thanks for watching, Caleb." His smile was tight, forced. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I never babysat for them again. A week later, they moved out of the neighborhood without saying goodbye. I still don't know what was in that basement. I don't want to know. All I know is that sometimes, late at night, when it's really quiet, I swear I can still hear that thump. Some jobs stay with you forever. This one's been stuck in my head like a splinter for years. I wasn't new to babysitting. By the time I was 17, I'd watched half the kids in our small town. People trusted me. I was responsible, dependable, and didn't bring my boyfriend over to raid their liquor cabinet. That's probably why the Andersons called me. They had 2 kids, Maddie and Sam, 7 and 4. Sweet, well-behaved, and easier to handle than most. When Mrs. Anderson asked if I could watch them one Friday night, it felt like just another job. I showed up at 6:30. The Andersons were running late. Mrs. Anderson still in her bathrobe. Mr. Anderson pacing by the door, jingling his car keys. She apologized 100 times, handed me a list of instructions, and told me they'd be back by midnight. Sam's been a little fussy today, she added, but he should be fine after dinner. Maddie gave me a shy wave, clutching a worn-out stuffed bear. Sam, meanwhile, was already in full meltdown mode, wailing about something I couldn't understand. The evening started off normal enough. I made macaroni and cheese, and once Sam had some food in him, he calmed down. We watched a movie, Toy Story, and I had both kids laughing by the time it ended. At 8 I started the bedtime routine. Maddie went down without a problem. Sam was a different story. He clung to me, refusing to get into bed. "I don't want to sleep in my room," he said, his voice quivering. "Why not, buddy?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he kept glancing at the closet. It's too dark," he finally mumbled. I showed him the nightlight plugged into the wall, the little stars it projected onto the ceiling. "See? Not so dark after all." He still wouldn't budge. "Mommy lets me sleep in Maddie's room sometimes," he said. That wasn't on the list of instructions, but I figured, why not? If it made him feel better, I wasn't about to argue. I tucked him into Maddie's bed, kissed them both goodnight, and closed the door. That should have been the end of it. But around 9:30, I heard a noise. It was faint, like shuffling feet, but distinct enough to make my skin crawl. I paused the show I was watching and strained to listen. Nothing. I told myself it was just the house settling. That's what people always say, right? But a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was louder. I got up and checked on the kids. They were sound asleep, Maddie sprawled out on her back, Sam curled up with his thumb in his mouth. I felt a little silly for being so jumpy, but as I headed back downstairs, I noticed something odd. The back door, the one in the kitchen, was unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it earlier. I always lock the doors when I babysit. My mom drilled that into me after watching one too many episodes of Unsolved Mysteries. My stomach dropped. I locked the door again, double-checked the windows, and tried to shake off the creeping paranoia. But then I heard it. A low, muffled thud, like something heavy hitting the floor. It was coming from the kids' room. My heart was racing as I ran upstairs. The door to Maddie's room was ajar, even though I'd closed it earlier. "Maddie? Sam?" I called softly, stepping inside. They were still asleep, but that closet door, was wide open. I swear it had been shut before. I crossed the room, trying to convince myself that Sam had gotten up and opened it earlier, and I just hadn't noticed. But when I looked inside, there was nothing there. Just some clothes, a few toys, and an old suitcase. Still, I shut it tight, wedged a chair under the handle for good measure, and went back downstairs. That's when the real nightmare began. I'd barely sat down when I heard the sound of glass breaking. It came from the kitchen. My chest tightened as I crept toward the noise, my phone clutched in one hand like a lifeline. The back door was wide open, there was shattered glass all over the floor, and the cold night air was spilling in. I froze, listening for any sign of movement, but all I could hear was my own breathing. I wanted to run, to grab the kids and get the hell out of there, but my legs felt like lead. Then I heard footsteps. They weren't heavy, lumbering steps. They were soft, deliberate, like someone trying not to be heard. The sound was coming from the stairs. I bolted upstairs, straight to Maddie's room. Both kids were awake now, rubbing their eyes, looking scared. "What's going on?" Maddie whispered. "We're leaving," I said, scooping up Sam and grabbing Maddie's hand. We didn't stop to grab shoes or coats. I carried Sam, practically dragging Maddie behind me, and ran out the front door. I didn't stop running until we were halfway down the street. I banged on the neighbor's door, screaming for help. Mr. Turner, the neighbor, came out with a baseball bat and called the police. When the cops arrived, they searched the house. They didn't find anyone, but here's the thing. The chair I'd wedged under the closet door, it was pushed aside. And the suitcase inside? It was open. Inside it, they found a knife, a roll of duct tape, and a pair of gloves. The Andersons moved out a month later. They never told me if they knew who it was or how they'd gotten in. I still babysit sometimes, but I never take jobs in unfamiliar houses, and I always check the locks. You think you're prepared for anything when you babysit, right? Crying, tantrums, maybe a kid throwing up after too much ice cream. But what happened that night, I'll never forget it. I was 19, home from college for the summer, and trying to make some extra cash before the semester started again. That's how I ended up babysitting for the Connors. They lived in one of those big new developments, rows of nearly identical houses with manicured lawns and not a soul in sight after dark. The Connors had one kid, Ella, a sweet little girl, 6 years old with dark curls and big brown eyes that made her look like a doll. The job seemed easy enough. Mrs. Connor gave me the usual rundown. Bedtime at 8:30, no sugary snacks, emergency numbers on the fridge. "We won't be back until late," she said, already halfway out the door. "Call if you need anything." It was a warm, quiet evening. Ella and I played board games, watched a bit of TV, and read a story before I tucked her into bed. She was out like a light by 8:45. By 9:30, I was on the couch with my phone, scrolling through Instagram and texting friends. The house was so quiet it felt like I was the only person alive. Then the doorbell rang. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Who rings a doorbell that late? I hesitated, staring at the door from across the room. The Connors hadn't mentioned expecting anyone. After a moment, I got up and peeked through the peephole. There was a man standing on the porch, his face partially shadowed by the porch light. He looked normal enough, mid-40s, wearing a jacket. He wasn't holding a package or anything, so he wasn't a delivery guy. "Can I help you?" I called through the door, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm looking for the Petersons," he said. His voice was calm, polite. "I think I have the wrong house." "Yeah, no Petersons here," I said. "Sorry about that," he replied, giving a small wave before turning and walking down the driveway. I watched him go until he disappeared into the dark. My heart was still racing, but I told myself it was no big deal, just a guy who got lost. An hour passed. Everything was quiet again. Then I heard it. A faint tapping sound. It was coming from the back of the house. I froze, my ears straining to pick up the sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was too deliberate to be the wind. My first thought was, Ella? What if someone was trying to break in? I grabbed my phone and crept upstairs to check on her. She was still asleep, her small body curled under the covers. Relieved, I went back downstairs, turning on every light as I went. I checked the windows and the back door. Everything was locked. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I sat back on the couch, my phone clutched in my hand, and tried to focus on the TV. That's when I noticed the reflection in the screen. There was a figure standing outside, just beyond the sliding glass door. I whipped around, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might stop. The man from earlier was standing in the backyard, staring straight at me through the glass. "Go away!" I yelled, my voice shaking. He didn't move. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hit the buttons. As I gave the dispatcher the address, the man stepped closer to the door, pressing his face against the glass. I'll never forget that face. Calm, expressionless, like he wasn't even human. "Officers are on their way," the dispatcher said. "Stay on the line with me." But before I could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the darkness. I stayed on the phone until the police arrived. They searched the yard, the street, even the wooded area behind the development. They didn't find him. I wanted to call Mrs. Connor and tell her to come home, but I didn't want to scare her. I stayed up the rest of the night, my eyes darting to the windows every few minutes. When the Connors came home around 2 a.m., I told them everything. Mrs. Connor went pale. "We had a break-in last year," she said quietly. "They never caught the guy. They installed a security system the next day. I never babysat for them, or anyone else, again. Sometimes I still see his face in my dreams, that blank, empty stare. Some people don't need monsters under the bed to scare them. Real life is terrifying enough.